In the winter of 1207, in a small chamber lit only by an oil lamp, a Sufi master named Abu Sa'id Abul Khair sat perfectly still for 7 consecutive days. His disciples, alarmed, checked for breath. They found him alive but elsewhere, his body present, his consciousness voyaging through realms that had no geography. When he finally opened his eyes, he spoke only 5 words: "I have seen the hidden sun." What he had discovered in that vast silence was not peace. Peace is the absence of disturbance. What he found was power, the silent atomic power that underlies all existence, the power that religions call God and physicists call the ground state of being. We have inherited a catastrophic misunderstanding about meditation. The modern world has sanitized it, commodified it, turned it into a stress management technique nestled between yoga and green juice. But the meditation practiced in the Sufi lodges of Baghdad, in the Khanqahs of Persia, in the desert caves where mystics went to die to themselves, this was not relaxation. This was controlled spiritual combustion. This was the science of ego death and soul resurrection. The Sufis understood something that modern psychology is only now beginning to grasp, that the mind is not the master, but the servant. That beneath the endless chatter of thought lies something vast, luminous, and transformative, what Jung called the self with a capital S, what the Sufis called the qalb, the polished heart. Tonight, we descend into the technology of silence that the mystics developed over centuries, a technology designed not to calm the mind so you can return to your busy life refreshed, but to shatter the mind so completely that what remains is no longer recognizable as the person you thought you were. The poet Rumi, initiated into these practices by the wandering dervish shams of Tabriz, spent decades mapping this terrain. He wrote not as a poet, but as a cartographer of consciousness, leaving breadcrumbs for those brave enough to follow. And Carl Jung, working in the sanitized laboratories of Swiss psychiatry, independently arrived at nearly identical conclusions through his encounters with patients hovering on the edge of psychosis and his own descent into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. These 2 men, separated by 7 centuries and an entire cosmology, discovered the same secret, that the journey inward is the most dangerous and most necessary journey a human being can undertake. Before we step through the threshold of this teaching, if what you have heard so far has awakened something dormant within you, if you sense that beneath the noise of your daily existence there is a silence calling to you, consider subscribing to this channel and joining this congregation of seekers. Press the bell so that these teachings find you when you need them most. And if this resonates with your own experience, if you have felt the tyranny of the restless mind, if you have tasted even a moment of that vast interior silence, or if you know someone who has walked this path or desperately needs to, leave a comment below. Your testimony becomes part of the transmission. Your words join the chorus of those who have discovered that the journey inward is not an escape from the world, but a return to it with new eyes. The Sufis did not approach meditation as a practice of concentration. They approached it as a practice of annihilation. The Arabic term is fana, extinction, the deliberate dissolution of the constructed self. Imagine a candle brought into direct sunlight. The flame does not go out. It becomes invisible, absorbed into the greater light. This is the Sufi ideal, not the strengthening of the ego, but its obliteration in the presence of the divine. The method they employed was deceptively simple, and for that reason, terrifyingly difficult. It begins with dhikr, remembrance. The practitioner sits in silence and begins to repeat one of the 99 names of God: Allah, Al-Rahman, Al-Wadud. But this is not mindless repetition. Each syllable is synchronized with the breath. Each breath is synchronized with the heartbeat. And slowly, gradually, something extraordinary happens. The boundaries between the one who remembers and that which is remembered begin to dissolve. Rumi describes this process with surgical precision in his Mathnawi. He tells of a lover who knocks on the door of the beloved. A voice asks, "Who is there?" The lover answers, "It is I." The door does not open. The lover wanders in the wilderness of separation until, emptied of himself, he returns and knocks again. The same voice asks, "Who is there?" This time the lover whispers, "It is thou." The door opens. This is not poetic metaphor. This is phenomenological description. In the deepest states of dhikr, the practitioner experiences what Jung called enantiodromia, the transformation of something into its opposite. The one who seeks becomes the sought. The subject collapses into the object. The observer and the observed reveal themselves as a single, seamless whole. But here we must address a danger, for the mystical path is littered with the wreckage of those who mistook dissociation for transcendence. Jung was acutely aware of this. He spent years treating patients in the Burgholzli psychiatric hospital who had shattered under the weight of unconscious material flooding an unprepared ego. He observed that in psychosis, the ego is overwhelmed, drowned in the collective unconscious. In mystical experience, the ego is also dissolved, but voluntarily, and with the crucial infrastructure of spiritual practice to contain the experience. The difference between madness and mysticism, Jung argued, is integration. The mystic descends into the abyss but brings something back. The psychotic descends and does not return. The Sufis understood this danger intimately. They insisted on the necessity of a murshid, a guide, someone who has already made the journey and can prevent the seeker from losing himself entirely. The path to self-transcendence is paradoxically the path through the self, not around it. You must know the ego intimately before you can relinquish it. You must construct the vessel before you can offer it as a sacrifice. Consider the physiology of what occurs during sustained meditative practice. Modern neuroscience has begun to map these states with fMRI and EEG, and what they have discovered would not surprise the Sufis in the least. In deep meditation, activity in the default mode network, the region of the brain responsible for self-referential thinking, for the constant narration of I, me, mine, begins to quiet. Simultaneously, activity in the prefrontal cortex, associated with concentration and intentional focus, initially increases, then also begins to dissolve. What emerges is a state of relaxed awareness, a paradoxical condition that the Sufis called sahu bafana, sobriety within intoxication. You are awake, hyper-awake, but the one who is awake is no longer the contracted, anxious, grasping ego. It is something vaster. The breath itself becomes the teacher. In Sufi practice, the breath is not merely a physiological function, but a sacred rhythm. The inhale drawing in baraka, divine grace, and the exhale releasing all that is not essential. Hazrat Inayat Khan, a Sufi master who brought these teachings to the West in the early 20th century, taught that every breath is a repetition of the divine name. With each inhale, the sound Ya rises. With each exhale, the sound Hu descends. Yahu, O Thou, the breath becomes prayer, prayer becomes breath. And in that seamless exchange, the meditator discovers that he has never been breathing himself, he has been breathed by something infinitely larger. Jung arrived at parallel insights through his practice of active imagination, a method he developed after his own psychological breakdown following his split with Freud. He would sit in silence and allow images to arise from the unconscious, not directing them, not analyzing them, simply witnessing. Figures emerged, landscapes unfolded. Sometimes the figures spoke, sometimes they remained silent. Over time, Jung realized that these were not hallucinations, but autonomous expressions of the psyche, fragments of the self-seeking integration. He wrote in his journal, now known as the Red Book, of conversations with a figure he called Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher. Philemon told Jung things he did not consciously know, taught him perspectives he had never considered. Jung came to understand that Philemon was a psychopomp, a guide from the collective unconscious, performing the same function as the murshid in Sufi practice. The psyche, Jung discovered, is not a monolith. It is a multiplicity seeking unity. And the path to that unity requires silence, not the silence of repression, but the silence of deep listening. The Sufis also understood that silence is not passive. It is not the absence of action, but the highest form of action. They spoke of the latifa, the subtle centers of spiritual perception located throughout the body. These are not physical organs, but loci of consciousness, somewhat analogous to the chakras in Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but understood differently. The first latifa is located in the chest, on the left side, the seat of the qalb, the heart. Meditation begins here. The practitioner directs his awareness to this point and imagines it as a luminous sphere. In the darkness behind closed eyes, this sphere begins to pulse with light. Not imagined light, light that is seen, phenomenologically present. Western science would explain this as a synesthetic phenomenon, a cross-wiring of sensory modalities under conditions of sensory deprivation and concentrated attention. The Sufis would say, "You are seeing the soul." Both may be true. As the meditation deepens, the awareness moves through the other lataif. The Ru in the right chest, the Sur in the solar plexus, the Kafi in the forehead, the Akfa in the crown, and finally the Nafs, the ego center, which must be purified, transmuted from Nafs al-Amara, the commanding self, to Nafs al-Mutma'inna, the self at peace. Rumi speaks of this journey with aching beauty in his poetry. I died as mineral and became a plant. I died as plant and rose to animal. I died as animal and I was human. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? This is not reincarnation. This is the phenomenology of transformation experienced within a single lifetime. Each stage of spiritual development requires the death of the previous stage. The rational mind must die for the intuitive heart to awaken. The personal self must die for the transpersonal self to emerge. And each death is terrifying because it feels like absolute annihilation. The ego, identified with its current structure, cannot imagine what lies beyond. It clings, resists, fabricates 1,000 distractions. This is why meditation is difficult. Not because sitting still is hard, but because the ego is fighting for its life. But what happens when the ego finally exhausts itself? When the meditator has sat through 1,000 sessions of mental noise, of fantasies, of plans, of regrets, of all the machinery of self-construction, and finally one day the machinery simply stops. The Sufis describe a moment they call the opening of the heart in Shira. It is not gradual. It is sudden, catastrophic, and unmistakable. The chest expands as if physically unlocked. Tears flow without emotion. Light pours in from a source that has no location. The meditator realizes with shocking clarity that the self he has been defending, nurturing, improving all these years is a fiction. Not metaphorically a fiction, actually, literally, a fiction. A narrative held together by memory and projection, by identification with thoughts, emotions, sensations. And in the absence of that narrative, what remains is not nothing. What remains is everything. Pure presence, unmediated awareness. What the Sufis call hakika, ultimate reality. Jung called this the encounter with the self, and he was careful to distinguish it from the ego. The ego, he said, is a complex, a cluster of associations, memories, and identifications that create the illusion of a separate, continuous I. The self, by contrast, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. It is the organizing principle behind the ego, the center that the ego orbits without realizing it. Most people live their entire lives identified with the ego, never suspecting that it is merely a satellite of something far greater. The mystical experience, whether through meditation, psychedelics, near-death, or spontaneous grace, is the moment when the ego catches a glimpse of the self and realizes its true position in the psychic cosmos. For some, this is liberating. For others, it is devastating. The inflation that can follow such an experience is dangerous. The ego, instead of surrendering, attempts to claim the experience as its own, declaring, "I am enlightened," which is the ultimate absurdity. The Sufis have a teaching for this. They say that the one who says, "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, I am God, must be killed. Not literally, though history records that the Sufi mystic al-Hallaj was indeed executed for uttering these words in Baghdad in the year 922. but symbolically, esoterically. The I that claims divinity must be annihilated so that the true I, which is not an I at all, but the divine expressing itself through this particular node of consciousness, can emerge. Now we come to the question that haunts every sincere practitioner. How does one actually do this? How does one sit in silence when the mind is a hurricane? The Sufi answer is both simple and devastating. You don't. Not at first. The beginner does not silence the mind. The beginner witnesses the mind. There is a teaching story. A young disciple came to his sheikh and said, "Master, I cannot meditate. My mind is like a wild horse." The sheikh smiled and said, "Do not try to tame the horse. Simply watch it run." The disciple was confused, "But I thought the goal was stillness." The sheikh replied, "The goal is not stillness. The goal is to discover the one who watches the horse. The one who watches is always still." This is the pivot point of the entire practice. The mind will not be silenced by force. Effort creates tension, and tension creates more thought. But if you shift your identity from the thinker to the witness, something miraculous happens. The thoughts continue, but you are no longer entangled in them. They pass like clouds across the sky of awareness. And the more you rest as the witness, the more the thoughts naturally begin to subside. Not because you are suppressing them, but because they no longer have anyone to perform for. Jung developed a parallel technique he called active imagination, but which might be better understood as passive observation. He instructed his patients to sit quietly and allow the unconscious to present itself in whatever form it chose: images, voices, sensations, emotions. The crucial instruction was this: do not interfere, do not analyze, do not interpret. Simply observe and, if appropriate, engage in dialogue, but always from the position of a witness, never from the position of a controller. What Jung discovered, and what the Sufis had known for a millennium, is that the unconscious does not need to be controlled. It needs to be heard. The neurotic symptoms, the compulsions, the anxieties, these are not enemies to be defeated, but messengers to be welcomed. They are fragments of the self attempting to communicate with the ego, and the ego, in its arrogance and fear, has been refusing the call. We have journeyed far tonight, through the chambers of the Sufi lodges, through the consulting rooms of Jungian analysis, through the neuroscience of meditative states, through the poetry of Rumi and the psychology of the self. But all of this knowledge is worth nothing if it remains abstract. The transmission of mystical teaching is not conceptual. It is experiential, so I invite you now, before you close this window and return to the world of obligations and distractions, to take a single breath with full awareness. Close your eyes. Bring your attention to the center of your chest. Imagine a point of light there, small as a seed, radiant as a star. Breathe into that light, and as you exhale, let the light expand, filling the cavity of your chest, then your entire body, then the room around you. This is not visualization. This is recollection. You are not creating this light. You are remembering it. It has been there all along, waiting beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the endless construction project of the ego. The Sufis offer us a teaching that is also a warning. The pathless path begins where you are right now, in this breath, in this silence. But it leads somewhere utterly beyond comprehension, beyond the self you know, beyond the world you perceive, into what Rumi called the tavern of ruin, where the wine is so intoxicating that you never sober up, and so purifying that you are burned clean of everything that is not love. Carl Jung, in his final years, wrote that the greatest tragedy of modern civilization is not that we have lost faith in God, but that we have lost faith in the soul. We no longer believe that the interior journey matters, that it leads anywhere real. We treat the psyche as a machine to be optimized, rather than a cosmos to be explored. But the mystics and the depth psychologists whisper to us from across the centuries, you are not a machine, you are a mystery, and the only way to know the mystery is to become it. So the question is not whether the practice works. The question is whether you are willing to sit in the silence long enough to let the false self die. Because it will die, and you will grieve. And in that grief, if you do not run, if you do not distract yourself, if you allow the silence to hold you, something will be born. something vast, something luminous, something that has been calling your name since before you were born. The Sufis call it the beloved. Jung called it the self. You may call it whatever allows you to finally, mercifully stop running and come home.